We are incredibly excited about the next guest on our show, and we are in the presence of podcast royalty, one half of possibly the best podcast duo on earth. Ben Gilbert, along with his co-host David Rosenthal, host The Acquired Pod, which as listeners to our show will know is my very favourite podcast on earth. Acquired started in October 2015 with its very first episode on Disney's acquisition of Pixar, getting a few hundred downloads in its first 6 months. Last month, David and Ben filled the Staples Center with 6,000 adoring fans and interviewed Mark Zuckerberg and Spotify founder Daniel Ek. They've become an absolute phenomenon, increasing their audience by 100% year on year and regularly achieving 500,000 listeners for every episode and approaching the magical 1 million mark, making Acquired likely the most popular business podcast in the world. Ben and David have themselves interviewed the likes of Charlie Munger, Jensen Huang, and Dara Khosrowshahi, and we are super pumped to have Ben Gilbert on the show with us. Ben, your journey itself will one day make a great Acquired episode, we think. You started as a product manager at Microsoft. I think you worked on famously Office for iPad and became a co-founder of Pioneer Square Labs, a startup studio and VC fund which partners with entrepreneurs. And then one pass overnight, you met a guy called David. Can you give us the inside story of how you guys went from meeting at a Seder one night to starting Acquired to basically building what you've built?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I apologize I didn't give you more recent numbers. We are now at 1 million listens per episode, which is pretty freaking
He probably knew that. He just gave you the chance to say that would be my
sure, that's what this was. Let's see. David and I met back in 2014, and the next year started Acquired. And when we met, we became fast friends. You know, when you just meet someone and you're sort of on the same wavelength, like, oh, we would really enjoy spending a lot of time together. But we were having a hard time actually spending that time together. We both had, busy jobs and lives, and David was married at the time, and we lived in different neighborhoods. And so whenever we wanted to get together and get drinks, it would be like 2 months before we were able to actually do that again, even though we kept saying, let's do it again soon. So we started the podcast kind of as a forcing function to hang out more often.
And this was in Seattle. You still live in Seattle, is that right?
I do, yes. David's in San Francisco. I'm in Seattle, though.
Yeah.
And so you guys started the pod, and obviously the name's Acquired, about acquisitions. I think your first, 25, maybe 30 episodes were all on acquisitions. And then you pivoted to IPOs. And then, of course, the Tesla episode, which sort of was the first episode where you guys didn't talk about an acquisition or IPO. Can you just talk about how you made that sort of pivot? And was it organic? Was it sort of listener suggested? How did you get there from a fairly limited show on acquisitions to obviously the massive show you've become on really telling stories about businesses?
It's a great question. I think half of it was just kind of chasing what our own interests were. I think if you lock yourself into a format and then force yourself to keep doing it, over time, we're all dynamic people. Your interests change. And so in order to keep the show good, you kind of have to give yourself the freedom to evolve the show with yourself, especially if you're going to do this for decades. And the other part of it was getting the freedom from listeners, earning the trust of listeners to do something different. So the way those sort of come together is when we first started, we thought the value being provided was an analysis and a grading. And over time, as David was the one with the insight, the storytelling seems to be going well with listeners. He got more interested in, actually the story arc of these companies is the interesting part. And we sort of knew from listeners, we'd sort of built up this trust with them where they were willing to let us sort of chase our passions a little bit. And for David, that was storytelling. And we floated it with a handful of people in the early Slack community, and they said, go for it.
It's interesting that you say storytelling. I mean, I think the core of all entertainment is narrative. That's the bottom line. And obviously, I'm heavily involved with pro sports. Pro sports, the game is just the narrative for something deeper. That is why people are so in love with watching sports. And I think the incredible thing about Acquired is it is very deep and sophisticated analysis. And we'll talk about Hamilton Helmer's 7 Powers, which I think is an incredible framework that you've chosen for the show. But it's this deep analysis wrapped in probably the most entertaining podcast that I listen to. And finding that balance, there's been this kind of nerdy word like edutainment for 30 years, and it kind of never works, but you got it to work. I think you found the perfect mix of entertainment and deep analysis and education around business.
Thanks. I mean, for the right listener, entertainment and education can be the same thing. I mean, I'm sure everyone, all of us have had, and probably everybody listening to this podcast has had that dinner party conversation where someone has an insight and you like kind of corner them and you're like, wait, tell me more about that. How did that go down? And you learn from this conversation. You're like sucking the insight out of them through story. And you walk away from that being like, I learned more tonight than I've learned in my job in the last month. And I was having an entertaining conversation with someone. And David and I try to make it feel like that.
I can tell you, like having gone through medical school, there is nothing more boring than the consumption of pure fact. It is unbelievably boring, and wrapping it in a story, it makes it much more entertaining and contextualizes it. And I think your ability to contextualize these stories is really remarkable. You said you're in Seattle, David's in San Francisco. Adam and I are actually in the same city, although, as you can see, not in the same building at the moment. But generally, the in-person recordings are far better, and the dynamic is far better than doing things remotely. Both of us travel a fair bit. How do you find doing remote recordings, which seem to be the majority of your episodes, and how does that compare to doing it in person for you?
Great question. We do in person whenever we're with a guest, where we have a new person that we need to build chemistry with. However, when it's just David and I, who've been friends for a decade and done this a lot, we find that there's actually no material benefit to getting together versus doing it remotely. In fact, there's a benefit to doing it remotely because the sound is super isolated. So what it actually does, I'm here in my acoustically dampened home studio, David's in his acoustically dampened home studio. When we talk over each other, doesn't matter. We just rearrange the audio in post. We've got an incredible editor, and it's like we had an organic conversation that happens to be highly parsable without any microphone bleed. So there's there's more tricks you can do when you're remote also.
But that is a pretty dramatic chemistry because I find rapport is difficult remotely. I mean, you look at companies doing Zoom meetings, it's universally a catastrophe. And the fact that you can have that chemistry remotely is really remarkable. You made me feel terrible, by the way, when you said with a guest that's important, you make sure you do it in person. I said to Adam, we should fly to Seattle to do this interview, but he was busy, so we couldn't make it happen.
I think my wife would have let me.
Thank you for thinking of it. For me, it's really it's about when I want to have a life experience. I viewed meeting Charlie Munger as a moment I'll remember for the rest of my life. I had to go do that in person. I feel similarly about flying to Stockholm and doing the episode with Daniel Ek in Spotify's, home office studio. It just felt like a life experience. And these would be these tremendous boondoggle opportunities that I was missing if I tried to do those remotely.
I think you actually, I was going to ask this later, but you've prompted me. I think if you look at now, and you and David are probably better placed than almost anyone to answer this, but I think with the exception of maybe the Robert Barron era with Rockefeller and Carnegie, we live in very much a time of founder mode. And obviously we have Brian's dissertation on that. And you guys are so well qualified to give you your views on, you've spoken to a lot of these people and you've certainly talked about, I think, all these people. Give you a short list of Jensen, Zuck, Gates, Jobs, Bezos, Musk. And I won't talk about Warren and Charlie and Bernard because they're more capital allocators than they were sort of classic founders. How do you rate those 6 founders? And you've spoken to Jensen, you've spoken to Zuck. I'm not sure about the other, obviously I haven't spoken to Jobs, but I'm not sure about the other 3. How do you rate those 6 based on all your analysis of their companies?
I will have an unsatisfying answer, which is there's no way I'm going to stack rank these people. They're all 6, 7 standard deviation from the mean humans. They're these extreme outliers. I will say, I think the most important thing to study about them is how they reacted in the early days of their companies, because now mostly what each of them are doing is running a big company. And sometimes they run it in a remarkable way where it doesn't feel like a big company. But especially for any entrepreneurs trying to apply any sort of lessons to their business, there's almost nothing to be learned from how Jeff ran Amazon in 2019 for your business. The interesting thing is how Jeff ran Amazon in 2001 or in 1997. And these are weirdly lost to history. Like, it's very hard to go find a news article from 1997 about Amazon unless you do this professionally, like David and I do. It's whenever you search for news about a company, you're going to get the last 2 weeks of news about the company. So I think, uh, uh, you know, the thing to study about any of these people is not who they are today, but what they were and the inflection points.
But I think that's a super interesting point. My experience, and this is with elite athletes, it's also with very successful business people. I think the quality of a business person is not necessarily correlated to whether or not they're a billionaire. There seems to be a heavy dose of luck in getting kind of across that 10-digit kind
essential.
of number.
It's essential. There are no billionaires who did not get lucky.
Yes.
Michael Mauboussin has this incredible book called I think it's the skill equation or something, the untangling skill and luck. And he has this great conclusion, which is the most extreme outliers, the LeBron James of every sport, the Bill Gates of business, require the sum of all the luck and all the skill. They're probably the luckiest and also the most skilled person on the planet in order to achieve that way over on the distribution outcome.
Yeah, I totally agree. And the thing that I found is the most common shared characteristic of all of the people that maybe I'd call them champions or just ultra high performers across different disciplines, the most significant commonality is the way that they respond to failure. And what you've just described in the early days essentially is high doses of failure coming at you pretty frequently. And I think that if you go back and look at, Bezos is an interesting one, but they're all similar. Like the level of failure that is occurring as you build a startup, and Adam and I have both, done these businesses, it's extreme. And the ability to bounce back from that, and you see it with elite athletes in particular. Everybody sees like the great moments of these elite athletes, but most of being an elite athlete is suffering and failing. And it's just the way that they rebound from those moments consistently that seems to turn them into champions. I thought the most interesting thing you did on the early days of Amazon, actually, because obviously you've done whole episodes on it, is there was an interview you did with Hamilton Helmer about pivoting to essentially a second act and using AWS as one of the core examples of a business pivoting. I don't think I've seen a business that has done as well as Amazon, but maybe Microsoft is close, as well as Amazon at finding a way to pivot to a second act. What do you think about that? I mean, effectively turning AWS into the core business of that company.
Apple.
This is, I think, one of my favorite topic areas is companies that actually innovated twice, like at the scale that had a multi-$100 billion world-changing innovation once and then tacked on a second business. It's unbelievably rare that most companies should forever just ride their core innovation, because I think these markets are actually a lot bigger than people think. So, take it international, take it up market, take it down market. And a lot of the times when people are, Google's other bets is famously a lighting cash on fire. Now, Waymo looks to be very interesting. There's one thing that's incredibly cash burning, but at least has product market fit.
But they're basically a search business with a crazy name. I mean, that's ultimately what Google is today, with Waymo as a hope.
You said it, not me, but that seems like a very reasonable way. If you look at their financial statements, that is the correct characterization. The businesses that have innovated twice, Hamilton actually spent a bunch of time studying, and he created this 2x2 axis. And I'll send this graphic to you guys so you have it. The x-axis is about skills that your organization has. On the left side, you have to build new skills. On the right side is your organization's current skills. Then the vertical axis is about customers. Do you serve new customer needs or do you serve current customer needs? And his assertion from looking at the data, which I thought was really fascinating, was the businesses that have succeeded in building a second act use your current organization's skills. You don't have to hire a bunch of new different things, but you serve a new set of customer needs. And AWS is a great example of this. Mm-hmm. They had the engineering talent. They had the internal culture of building APIs. They don't want teams talking to each other. They sort of famously treat other teams within the company as if they are external companies, and they build an API in order for that team to consume the technology they've created. What they did need to do was figure out enterprise sales and figure out how to sell their wares to startups instead of consumers. But they did. And that is sort of the perfect encapsulation of this. You're using your current skills, but serving a new customer. And that's his advice, at least, on where organizations should look for their second act.
I mean, I might as well ask you this question now before we move on. So I think using Hamilton Helmer's book Seven Powers has been it's a tremendous cornerstone of the show. I've read a lot of strategy books. I think they're mostly junk. They're mostly a singular idea that really is a magazine article that has been padded out into a book. I thought Good to Great was maybe the exception, but generally they're very weak. Seven Powers is probably the best, well, without doubt, it's the best strategic framework I've ever come across. Two businesses I'm involved in now use it in their strategy planning. How did you come across that? And obviously, we're all looking for the eighth power, so we can talk about that later. But how did you even come across this Seven Powers book and incorporate it so completely into the show?
A great question. David definitely was the one who found it and recommended it. It was sort of a low-key thing in Silicon Valley that a lot of people had read it but weren't touting it. And I don't know if that's because they looked at it as like, ooh, I have a strategic advantage that I have access to this book. I don't quite think it was that.
That would be unusual in Silicon Valley. Usually, if you have something that makes you sound 1% smarter than other people, you're trumpeting it.
Yeah. It was endorsed by Reed Hastings. You sort of, you're like, who's this Hamilton Helmer guy? What's this book? And right on the front cover, you're like, oh, is Reed Hastings' favorite strategy book? He's like one of the best strategists ever. I think we may have seen it in a tweet from Keith Rabois, who first pointed it out. But in any case, once David and I both read it, it almost felt like a no-brainer to incorporate it into the show because it created a framework for something that our stories were begging for, but we didn't have the words to explain it. And in particular, that is, what is it that entitles a business to be more profitable than their nearest competitor? There's always some structural reason. It's not just they're better at executing, because that's not a durable strategic advantage that comes and goes over time and typically tends to just fade over time. Your best execution is usually early days, and then you get worse and worse and worse as you dilute the culture and the talent. And so we were sort of, I feel like, wishing for something like this. And then once we found it, I really think the Seven Powers are an exhaustive list of the ways in which a business does deserve those durable incremental profits over their nearest competitor.
Well, you've shifted a lot of books, I'm sure, because I've shifted 50 for him just in Australia and people that I've told. So I imagine that the sales rise. And, as you mentioned, books on the show, I'm a huge book fanatic. And so as you mentioned books on the show, I try to buy them. And I've occasionally succeeded, but mostly you just run them out of town when you recommend them on the show. If they're out of print, then there's no chance of getting them. I mean, you should just start a business that puts books back into print, essentially, because you probably shift 50,000 of them. It's just amazing the impact you have on the book market when you recommend a book.
Yeah, we've actually considered that if we should be like an imprint or like a second. I mean, most of the time these books have zero demand for them, which is why they're out of print. But they end up being a key part of our research when we're trying to unearth the past and what made these companies succeed. And so I wouldn't even do it as a profit-making endeavor. I'd just like to get more of this wisdom out into the world. So I think if there were more hours in the week, this is totally something David and I would consider.
Well, I'll subscribe to it. I'll be your first subscriber to every, just send them this way.
One thing that you did bring up that I want to make a point of, you were talking about how a lot of business books are sort of rubbish or write things that are easily disproven. One of the reasons why Acquired hasn't put out a book yet, because it's sort of a natural path for us. Why don't you take all your learning, summon it into a business book that then has these patterns that you can follow and other people can learn from. Hamilton has managed to do this, and many other people try to do it, but then over time it doesn't, hold water. I think that's actually the key insight of Acquired is each of these massive, massive successes are such extreme outliers that their success is idiosyncratic. The bigger takeaway is actually there's not that much to learn from them than than the takeaway being here's what you can learn from them and apply to their own business. And that is not very gratifying if you are listening to the show and you're sort of saying, I want to absorb this wisdom and use it for my business. And maybe I'm being too tongue in cheek. Maybe there is a lot there, but I think it's important to remember the more extreme the success, the more idiosyncratic the conditions were that allowed it to happen.
I think you're being too harsh on your yourself in that. Like, I think the way that you have a narrative that runs through this is extremely relatable to people that run businesses. And I think that is one of the strengths of the show, that, you know, there's not a lot you can learn from NVIDIA or TSMC, maybe my favorite company, that you can apply in your business. But there's some of it, and certainly some of the powers. Yeah. And I just want to, before I hand over to Adam, I want to say to you, Sol Price, that book, I mean, good luck getting that book. I've been waiting for that book for probably a year since you talked about it, longer.
Really?
Yeah, impossible to get.
I'll follow up with you after. You actually can just email Robert and he will send you a copy.
Is that right? Well, this is a great conversation, but even if I only got 30 seconds and that's what I got out of it, this would be a golden conversation.
So then you guys obviously analyze businesses every month, and we want to flip it, and I want to, I'm sure I do. I want to analyze the acquired business, and let's analyze in terms of Hamilton Helmers Forces. I'm not sure if you guys do it on yourself. I know obviously Adir and I do it for our businesses. When you look at Helmers 7 Powers, you guys have built this incredible franchise, and we'll talk, you may be uncomfortable, but I want to talk about sort of valuation of what you guys have built as a business. But you've grown organically over 10 years, virtually zero marketing, a couple of really great articles, one quite recently in the journal that helped you a lot. But you've built a pretty incredible franchise in the podcast world. When you go through the powers, take out, obviously you've got brand, but other than brand as a podcast, which powers do you think exist around acquired that you've been able to build in the 10 years? And we'll talk about our mythical 8th power. I think actually may apply to you guys, but I'd love to hear your views on how do Helmers powers apply to acquired.
Well, you mentioned brand, and I think there is something to trust. I think there's brand in the typical sense of I have a Tiffany box that has a ring in it versus an unbranded box with a ring in it, and I'm willing to pay more for Tiffany because of the sort of signaling associated with it.
Which is brand as pricing power, basically. I would characterize that.
Well, in a sense, all of the 7 powers are pricing power. It's really why is it that you can charge more for your product than the nearest competitor, and any of these could be the reason.
Well, that's a great debate, because the flip side of brand is, when I think about brand, I think there's pricing power, there's reducing CAC. That's another strength of brand. So that's the corollary of pricing power, I guess. And then the third one for me with brand, which I've thought about deeply, is this. You look at Nike today. I mean, that has not been a well-run company for the last few years, but they have a second shot. And the reason they have a second shot is that customers love the brand so much, they will give them a second shot. But if this was Nike 6 years into their journey, that would be the end of Nike. So anyway, I've interrupted you, so you should, but I'm not sure it's all pricing power. I think there are other strengths that these powers actually give you in business.
Fair. The way in which brand really shows up for acquired is trust. There are sponsors that will work with us, that is our primary revenue stream, where they would not work with other people. And the reason is because they're listeners themselves and they're aware of the incredible trust that we've built with the audience. And David and I take it, I mean, everything starts and ends with listener trust. And so I think every time we sort of get too wrapped up in a conversation, should we do this? Should we do that? A strategic decision, we keep coming back to the thing that matters is to make the next great episode for listeners as amazing as it possibly can be. And everything else is downstream of that. So that's sort of the way that we think about brand. Now,
can I pitch you that you have all three of those brand things? So your acquisition cost is close to zero. So that is word of mouth, which is some variation of brand. I think you have pricing power, because my guess is that the amount you're charging sponsors exceeds what you should be able to charge them based on the reach of your podcast. I might be wrong about that, but my guess is that, notwithstanding you've got a great a demographic for a listener base. The personalities that the two of you have and the personal brands you have, I think, give you some pricing power in sponsorship that that you may not otherwise have, or that a generic podcast wouldn't have. And the third point I'd make is, if you produce a bad episode, which you don't, but let's say you did, I'm still coming back and listening to the next episode because your brand is strong enough that you can buy second chances from me as a customer.
I like that take. I will say the part of the reason why the business works so well, why the sponsorship works so well, you're right. Buying a spot on Acquired on a per listener basis would be more expensive than buying a generic, mattress ad on your median podcast. But a part of that also is we have chosen only to work with a set of customers for which the product is most valuable to them. And we have because we have this notion of like expiring or rare inventory, most companies are willing to make an infinite amount of widgets to sell. We have 3 widgets to sell per season. So what we're basically doing is we're saying, okay, who are these widgets worth to the company who has the most value out of them? The people who listen to the show are executives, are decision makers that control massive budgets and buy huge financial or software products. Let's go talk to those companies that make the best financial and software products and see which ones that then we kind of make some judgment calls after we kind of survey the market and say, who do we feel is the best product and the best brand in this space that we're then willing to represent to our audience. But that's kind of the process or that's the insight is if you fix the number of products you're willing to make. And for us, that's sponsor slots. Then you can kind of play this game where you can figure out who is your product worth the most to of the universe of people who could buy it.
I think, I was on Jay Kell's podcast like probably a decade ago, This Week in Startups. And what I thought was interesting about what he did was that he said that the only sponsors he allows on the show are brands that he uses personally. And I think like you've done the next generation of that. Your ad integrations, frankly, are the best that I've come across. But I thought that lent a lot of his personal brand credibility to the brands that were on the show. And the two of you do that really well as well. I agree with you. Like the sponsorship stuff does not feel like in your face advertising on the pod.
Thanks. And now that David and I also are investors. And so we also, after, getting to know these companies, will often also invest, which in some ways adds another layer of credibility where when we're delivering the pitch and we say, by the way, we're now also shareholders in this company. That's how much we believe in them.
Yeah, I agree.
If you look at the other powers, I don't think process power and at the moment counter positioning is really that relevant. I think you probably do have scale in a sense that you can get
absolutely.
You can get Zuck on the show, you can get Daniel Ek on the show, you can get Jensen on the show. We can't get those guys on our show, so you've got some pretty incredible scale that is, and whether that sort of bleeds into network, probably not. I'd love to get your sort of thoughts on that.
Fake network effects Acquired has, like all podcasts. It looks like network effects, but it doesn't really benefit the existing listeners.
Well, it does if you get a better
maybe
talent. Yeah.
Maybe.
Ben, what are your views on that?
The only way network effects shows up, I think, is if you're a member of the Slack community. You benefit from more people listening to the show and joining the Slack community. But I don't think network effects is where we derive our power. I think scale economies is a big one. Interestingly, I know you brought up guests. Most of our episodes don't have guests. There's mostly, as you know, David and I just analyzing the company. But scale economy still shows up because we both spend hundreds of hours making that one episode. Most people can't quit their job and spend hundreds of hours making one podcast episode. They need to do something that is economic for them. And they're going to, if the goal is to compete with Acquired, you need 10 years of ramping up the audience base in order to amortize the research across this many listeners. So I often ask myself, like, why don't we really have competitors? It's quite odd. And I think the reason is if someone tried to sort of intentionally compete with us, they would do it from a network, a media company that is hiring hosts. And already when you're a hired gun, you're going to have less passion for something than if you're the founder of it. Or if you're trying to found it from scratch, you're going to make worse episodes because you can't possibly sink in the time, care, attention, and gut for what stories are going to land in and tell them in the same way that David and I have built up over the last 9 years. And so there's this weird thing where, like, because we can amortize all of our research hours across a million people who we know are going to listen, that adds some defensibility to it.
But you undersell yourself again. I'm going to pump up your tires again by saying I agree with everything that you just said. But one of the reasons you don't have many competitors is the same reason that Federer didn't have many good competitors for most of his career. Like, you're just fundamentally at the very top of this game. And it would be very difficult for people to be able to replicate the narrative, the intelligence behind it, the content behind it. I think your scale benefits, even when you don't have guests. You can ring up the person who runs Novo Nordisk and you can have a conversation with them. And people starting from scratch, a founder starting from scratch, the CEO of Novo Nordisk is not taking their call, which was, by the way, a great episode, I thought. And so I think that's the other scale benefit. Even when it's not a guest, it's just access to people.
Yeah, access definitely developed in our 7th or 8th year, that's for sure. I'm underselling, but it's because I'm trying to box this discussion into strategy, not operating excellence. And all those things you just named, the fact that we're really good at this is just operational excellence, not actually a structural strategic advantage.
I'd love to pick up on that.
I guess it's a cornered resource of David and I.
Yeah, I think if you look at the operational brilliance, and there's a really small subset of businesses, and this is our 8th power. And I think Hamilton almost talks about it within process power, but I don't think it is, because I think process power, if you look at Toyota, the classic Toyota example of process power, it's different to this. And we've tried to work out a name, but something we'll call it product brilliance. And there's a handful of businesses that, and this isn't sort of one great game or one great song or one great podcast. It's sustained product brilliance over a long period where you're able to produce a better product for less money. And I think the two best examples we've come across of this is Nintendo, which over 40 years has produced consistently better products for less cost. And the other one is HBO, which since the 70s spends
until 2022.
Yeah, had spent 1/10 of what Amazon and Apple spend to get an Emmy is spent by HBO. And they had that incredible run of creative brilliance. And you can say that's great operational execution, but that is operational execution over multiple generations of leadership, of multiple generations of people. So it feels like it's deeper than just a really good executor. And it feels like you guys have that in the pod. And whether you call it product or UI UX or whatever it is, feels like there's that sort of 8th power that we haven't been able to name, but a really small subset of businesses seem to have ongoing. Are we completely wrong here, or is there some element that...
Can you explain one more time how it's different than process power?
Well, I think the problem with process power is that, so Adam and I have this debate. So, when I thought about this concept, I was very excited about an 8th power. And then I thought, process power is the weakest, I think, of the powers in terms of its elucidation as part of the book. And Hamilton's pretty open about that. And so You're right. Like, the question is this what process power really is? The ability to generate superior product for no incremental cost over an extended period of time. And I think, the challenge with podcasts is it's hard to extend that beyond the hosts. Is process power something different, and is it actually an 8th power, and when does it kick in? But there is definitely something magical. Nintendo's a great example because they made a conscious decision to say, we're not going to chase the tech superiority anymore. We're going to deploy existing relatively cheap technology in much more innovative ways and just create more immersive, better games. They've done it over an extended period and it doesn't cost them any more. And they just do it over and over again, and others can't replicate that approach for whatever reason. So yeah, that is a good question. Is it the real process power, or is it something else?
It may be that you've just found a better articulation of process power than even Hamilton did. But I agree that everything you're talking about is a defensible thing. There's a sort of a naming convention question. The Pixar process for the first 20 years of Pixar is another great example of this. Like, why is it just hit after hit after hit? Why is it that they manage to catch, that they have this incredible ideation process and filter to make sure everything that leaves the factory is incredible?
And it's,
I think
it's got to be something about talent acquisition and retention and some processes that are in place that are superior. But there is just some magic that is inculcated into the culture of the organization that just produces these endless hits. And anyone can produce a better product if they spend tons more money. I mean, but that's not that hard. I mean, selling $2 for $1, well, that's like a lot of startups do that when they start. But doing it for a price does not have incremental input costs to something that's inferior over an extended period, that to me feels like one of the greatest powers. And I mean, we talked about it. You talked about it just now, in terms of intellectual property, but in the retail space, you think about a business like Hermes, who was maybe my favorite episode that you've done, although there's a long list of competitors for that. Like they charge,
but no one has as much whimsy as Hermes. There is something special. I don't understand how no one is
because it's a power. That's why. Yeah. Because I mean, they have some cornered resources, maybe with their own people that they've trained and do this crazy stuff that no one does anymore. And they're saddle stitching, and I mean, I've listened to the episode twice, but but there is something in there that says even if they weren't charging $10,000, they could charge $1,500 for a bag and still have enormous margins. And there is something about the consistent production of a superior quality product that gives them some kind of long-term power to outperform the margins of their competitors, even if they didn't have the extra $9,000 of brand to add to the price.
I just want to talk about you guys because you've become a pretty big, and obviously the Wall Street Journal article I talked about went into great detail and was a really good article, and I think was incredible for your brand, which I think has almost doubled your listenership of already very high base. There's obviously been Joe Rogan and Call Her Daddy and Smartless have had some massive podcast deals in the last, Rogan a few years ago and Call Her Daddy and Smartless this year. And if you look at, and this is all public, so there's nothing sort of hopefully that's uncomfortable here, but if you look at what the journal said, it looks like you guys are, and talking to you about your high CPMs, pulling in something like 600 grand an episode in sponsorship, which still feels cheap, to be honest, given your listener base and given how Hermes your brand is. And I think when we talk about corner resource, I reckon there's almost a bit of a corner resource in your back catalogue, which is probably the best back catalogue of any podcast on earth. And it's a back catalogue that actually appreciates versus every other back catalogue that depreciates. So it's I think in many ways, an appreciating asset. So if you simply add those two things, and you got obviously live shows and plenty of other stuff you're able to do, you're investing, that's probably 10 million revenue run rate. So then what multiple do we give you guys? You guys are 100% annual growth, zero CPA because you don't pay for you don't do any marketing. I think you probably could do marketing and it would be probably highly profitable. But
gross margin asymptotes to 100%.
Pretty much 99% gross margin.
Net revenue retention rate is, like 200% probably. 200%.
So let's say we give you a SaaS multiple, it's 15 times revenue SaaS multiple, and that's arguably conservative. Is my valuation of $150 million US on you guys conservative? Agree? It's probably hard for you to talk about this, but maybe I'll get Adir's view. But you've built an incredible brand. You've talked about these great businesses, but you've been able to build one while talking about one, which not many people have actually been able to do.
Well, I think a way you can extend that question is to say, at the moment, you've got two podcasts. And I assume that AC2 does not have the level of popularity as the core acquired podcast.
Correct. Dramatically smaller.
Yeah. And so a more interesting question, I guess, is, Adam's going to kill me if I say more interesting. Let's say a question extension, we'll call it, would be, A and B. This is not, by the way, the most polite Adam and I've ever been on a podcast to one another. So we're on the best behavior for you, Ben. So the questions are maybe, I guess, one, do you think you're just going to end up signing a deal like the kind of Rogan type deals with some kind of publisher rather than continuing to be independent? How do you think about that, I guess? And two, do you think that this is a business or do you think this is a podcast? Is it a piece of content that you created, or are you going to start building out an entire business from this core initial asset that you've created?
Such good questions. Starting with the comment on the back catalog, just to validate an assumption, I do think you're right, Adam. Our math is that over a third of listens in any given month are to the back catalog. That is episodes older than 6 months. I think that's by far and away the leader across all, whatever, 4 or 5 million podcasts that exist.
I I'm totally unsurprised by that statistic. One is you can't produce content fast enough for the speed that I want to consume it, so I have to go back. And two is like, because each one is on a separate business, the minute I discover you, I just want to consume all the other business conversations that you've had.
Yeah. And we made a shift, call it 2018 or so, where we really became obsessed with being timely, but
Yeah.
also timeless.
Yeah, evergreen
we
content.
wanted every
yeah.
episode, with the exception of kind of 5 minutes at the end, to really feel like it has nothing to do with the moment that it was released.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a big component of it too. We want them to feel more like books than, like newspaper articles that you're sort of scrolling through quickly on a website that have headlines. So maybe I'll answer the valuation question. That is the order of magnitude that we think about the value of the franchise. And of course, we've talked to we regularly get outreach from the type of people that do the big podcast deals, and we really like being independent. And I think there are so many wonderful things to being a partnership of two people that own a business 50-50 and are fully the principal and fully the agent, where you can make better stuff and put it out in the world than people where there's a little conflict of interest between the principal and the agent. And we just feel like that's a sustainable competitive advantage, that we own it together. We own all the upside and all the downside. The business itself, as you mentioned, is a great current business. Our lives do not require the type of capital that we could sell this business for. And if we did sell it, what would we do? We probably would want to go make a podcast like this one together. So, it ends up kind of coming down to what is the life or what is the optimization function of a business. If you're a publicly traded company, the optimization function is grow share price. But if you're a 50-50 private partnership, the optimization function is whatever best enables the two of us to enjoy our time here on Earth. So I think it's sort of a different goal than we have than if we were something that had shareholders.
There's such a great answer to hear, I have to say. Like, that is music to both of our ears, frankly. I think, like happiness, if you plot happiness against wealth, I think it's normally distributed, that graph. And like, you just got to make sure you don't go over the hump. And I think the hump is a lot earlier than people think it is. And my view is there's not much you can buy with $500 million that's good that you can't buy with $50 million or maybe $5 million. But there's a lot of bad stuff you can buy with $500 million that you can't buy with 50. And so I think it's an amazing and very refreshing answer from you.
Yeah. I mean, look, I don't want anybody playing this tape at some point in the future if we decided to do some particular
after
deal
your sellouts. Yeah,
exactly. But this is absolutely how we feel at this moment in time. This is how I think that I laid out the conflicts that you then have to manage if you have decided to sell out, and the pitfalls you have to watch for.
Why is cap table not a power? I mean, you're a VC, you know, like what cap tables do to businesses sometimes. It doesn't quite fit into one of the 7 powers, but you just talked about the long-term competitive advantage that you get by the cap table that you have. Essentially, I'm simplifying, but like, why is that not recognized as more of a strategic power? Because it definitely is a strategic power.
Right. It's incentive alignment. Where would incentive alignment fall? That all there's no principal agent problem.
Exactly, which you put in counter positioning. Oh, not you. Hamilton, I think, puts that sort of stuff in counter positioning, where you start getting agency problems.
Yeah, that would make sense.
Yeah.
In some ways, it's not as much a power as it is. We don't have some particular downside. It's like asking, why are we better than a business where the whole executive team is running around half drunk all day? It's like, well, they have a self-inflicted wound. That's not really like a power as much as like they just decided to have a wound. And so I think that's part of it too.
And so you said it talked about being independent, but do you think you're going to stay essentially with the acquired podcast and the spin-off AC2, or is this part of a media empire that you're going to build out?
David and I like to experiment with one new thing a year. Any more than that, it tends to risk making the product worse. since again, it really is just us and a really great audio engineer editor.
There's no researchers,
And
right? The research is all you reading books and talking to people.
totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think we find things that we wouldn't find if we were reading someone's summarized
Yeah.
PDF that we hired them to create and send us. There was in 2018, we experimented with a paid podcast and a membership program. We've been, as you mentioned, ACQ2 is a second podcast. It's an interview show where we interview sort of up and coming people as they're building their businesses. Up and coming now means because the scale of everything has changed. They're mostly public company CEOs, but they're smaller listed companies. This year, we experimented with what happens if we fill the Chase Center with 6,000 people and interview Mark Zuckerberg. And you can imagine there are other things that we have in the hopper right now that we're trying to figure out for 2025. What is the experiment that we play with? But it's slow, it's judicious, it's moving at the pace of university endowment rather than startup, and being really careful with our brand. I think that's something that we've sort of taken from Hermes. Be innovative, but do it on a sort of decade scale instead of a month scale.
I think the live shows are great. I mean, you talked about the one that you just did where, a couple of people, I sit on a few boards, and one of the founder CEOs, Robbie Sharon Zipser, came across with his team to that. And I know met you afterwards at kind of your private function, but absolutely raved about that episode, like presented it to the board meeting, essentially. I also thought the smaller ones you did before that, like where you interviewed the Brooks CEO, I thought that was a fascinating conversation as well.
Jim has one of the greatest comeback stories of all time building the Brooks brand. That's something where every entrepreneur can kind of learn from it. His conviction around the way that the running market would materialize, and then what he should do about it if he was right in order to build that business is just one of the best case studies ever.
Can I ask you a couple of questions about the episodes themselves? So,
sure.
Which episode was the biggest? I don't want to say which is the most popular because it's correlated to the number of listeners that you have. So let's put that to the side. But which is the one that kind of hit it out of the park in ways that you hadn't expected when you released it?
Are you asking me which one sort of had let's call it like day 7+, which one sort of outperformed its cohort?
Well, that's a good way of describing it. I'm the master of kind of vague and non-specific questions. So you've improved that question dramatically. So that's a good way to answer it.
Well, I happen to graph every day of every episode since release. So this is quite doable for me to look up. One great example is the Costco episode. Where it started, I'm looking at it, it was performing upon release pretty similar to something from its vintage, NVIDIA Part 3, which was the next episode. And that episode sort of tapered the way that we would expect over time. But Costco kind of never tapered. It kept just like linearly running and then ended up sort of joining a cohort of episodes that we would release later when our audience was way bigger. So it sort of started slower because it wasn't as recent, and then finished unbelievably strong. The reason
you should let Adam talk about his view on the Costco episode, because I'm sure that's your favorite episode, right, Adam?
It is. I just want to hear Ben's finishing his reasoning. Then
I think the reason is, despite this business looking almost boring and simple on its surface, it is a complex, interlocking set of mechanisms that make the business work. And once you start like peeling the onion, you're like, oh my God, look at this incredible, Rolex inside this thing that on the outside just looks really boring.
Yeah, I think the other thing we talked about when you said, people can't use your episodes for inspiration. I used the Costco episode for a significant rollout of our strategy in our business. So I think that was a really relevant bit, the way they've built that network and obviously the Bezos flywheel in a different sense. And two Seattle retailers have came across really similar phenomenon. But it doesn't surprise me that episode was so good because, and I think that was the third pivot third or fourth pivot when you went from tech businesses, and LVMH really was the episode, but Costco sort of followed that when you went from tech businesses to businesses, like great businesses.
And LVMH, by the way, is the other big example of this, where it sort of jumped cohorts. It started kind of slow, or it started as you would expect based on where our audience was at the time. And then when you look at the graph, you're like, whoa, that thing just kept kind of linearly and in some cases even inflected and and accelerated, 4 or 5 months into its release because it just got shared so much.
I think you might have experienced some of LVMH's brand power in that episode, to be honest. Like, who doesn't want to listen to the story of LVMH?
Oh.
The guy was the richest guy in the world for a while. I mean, it's just an incredible story. And the answer to this question might be like nothing and just silence. So, but is there one episode that you did where when you and David started researching it, you thought it would be one type of story and it ended up being a completely different type of story that you discovered, or much more like intricate or interesting, or the interesting part about the story was not what you had expected it to be?
Yeah, I think this happens to some degree every time, where I think Costco is another. This happened in Costco. The reason that I think it's going to be interesting is not actually the reason why I end up realizing it's interesting. Maybe the best example of this is Lockheed Martin.
Oh my God, I was going to suggest that was the one for me that was totally different to what I expected when I started listening to it.
And this one's fun because David found a huge aspect of the company that I didn't even know was coming. So he got to tell me authentically, fully on air, something I had no idea about. And it was like a 30 to 45-minute chapter of that episode about Lockheed missiles in space, which essentially led to the creation of Silicon Valley.
Yeah, I thought that episode. I'm so happy that you said that episode. And I think the way that you don't rehearse it and it's not scripted, and you have those moments where, like you're surprised or he's surprised. I think that really adds to the chemistry of the podcast. I really enjoy that.
Thanks. That was something, so many of these things, I think the things that make Acquired special, many of them are a listener pointed it out, or we studied a business and then took something from it. Like from Hermes, we took scarcity. From Costco, we took low SKU count and simplified operations. From Taylor Swift, we took a lot.
Yeah.
From Charlie Munger, I think we took the key to life is low expectations. It's about keeping that burn rate low, and then you have max optionality because you haven't backed yourself into a corner. From
what about Zuck? You just interviewed Zuck. I mean, he's had the reinvention of all reinventions, that guy, and there might be limits to what you can say, considering you probably know moderately well now. But that's an incredible human being.
Oh, Mark Zuckerberg is singular. I think in getting to spend some time with him, in and around that episode, and actually our next episode is going to be meta. So I spent an endless amount of time watching him talk over the last 20 years. He is, many standard deviations from the mean on intelligence, on strategic thinking, on product design, in understanding the technical requirements of a product. Like he can, at the same time he conceives of a product idea, understand the technical requirements underneath it and sort of co-ideate these things. And many people sort of fall flat on that, where they think of this great experience, but they can't really understand what it will take to get there. Or the other side, they know how to build something really interesting, but they don't necessarily know that that's going to resonate with customers. I think these things are like one and the same in Mark's brain, and it's remarkable.
And you've been incredibly generous. We asked for half an hour of your time. You've given us an hour. I think I've always thought there are two people in the world. There's people who are super generous with their time and the people who just aren't. And you are clearly in the former category. I messaged you and thinking, there's no way Ben will reply. He probably gets literally 1,000 messages a week. And based on how many I get, and you got an X times bigger show than us. So you must spend like half your day responding to people.
You wrote a great email. I mean, to be honest, I don't respond to most emails, and this just sounded really interesting.
Well, he was super generous, and
hopefully we lived up to the expectations, exceeded. I like that Charlie Munger approach to life. I would heavily encourage you to adopt that with this podcast, so we can massively overachieve your expectations.
We have. We've had Ben on, which is a huge achievement in our books. Ben, we're massive fans of the show, massive fans of yours and David. You've done such an amazing job. I get more joy out of Acquired than almost anything entertainment-wise on earth. So we're super grateful for all you do. And again, thanks for coming on the show. It's incredibly generous of you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ben.
Thanks. Appreciate it.